Welcome to this deep dive into the world of disinformation. We'll be taking a close look at an academic journal article titled The Disinformation Order, Disruptive Communication and the Decline of Democratic Institutions.
Yeah,
It's a pretty dense title,
it is.
but we're going to explore how the spread of false information can actually destabilize democracies.
Yeah,
It's a big topic.
it's a complex issue
Yeah.
with far-reaching consequences.
And the article kicks off with this story. That sounds like something kind of out of a spy thriller.
Right.
It's about a filmmaker named Ami Horowitz who appears on Fox News,
Uh-huh.
claiming there's this huge crime wave in Sweden
Right.
caused by refugees.
Yeah.
And this claim, which was debunked by the Swedish government, was then picked up by President Trump
Wow.
and cited in a speech. And shortly afterward, there was even an attempt by a Russian news crew to stage a fake riot in Sweden to try and support the original claim. It's a
Oh, wow.
pretty bizarre chain of events. That's wild. It sounds almost comical, but the authors of the article use this story to illustrate a much bigger problem, the spread of disinformation and its impact on our trust in institutions.
Exactly. This isn't just about isolated cases of fake news, We're talking about something much more deliberate and organized, disinformation, which is the intentional spread of falsehoods to achieve specific political goals.
So, not just someone sharing something on social media that turns out to be false, but an orchestrated campaign to mislead people.
That's right. The article defines disinformation as inaccurate or manipulated information content that is spread intentionally.
Okay.
And this intentionality is a key distinction between disinformation and misinformation. Misinformation is simply false information,
Right.
which might be spread accidentally. Disinformation, on the other hand, is a weaponized falsehood.
Okay, that distinction makes sense. So, how does this all tie into the rise of radical right movements that we've been seeing around the world?
Well, the article argues that disinformation, combined with a decline in public trust, has created fertile ground for these movements to take root and grow.
You mean people are more susceptible to these extreme ideologies if they've lost faith in traditional sources of information?
Exactly. If you already believe that the system is rigged against you,
Right.
that the media is lying to you, and that the government can't be trusted, then you're much more likely to be drawn to groups that offer simple explanations and scapegoats for complex problems.
And the article points out how radical right movements are really good at using disinformation to their advantage.
That's right. They've become masters at exploiting existing anxieties and grievances, often using dog whistle tactics and coded language to appeal to people who feel marginalized or left behind.
Like how they attack the mainstream media as fake news to discredit any reporting that challenges their worldview.
Precisely. They present themselves as the only source of truth, the only ones who are willing to tell it like it is. And unfortunately, this strategy can be incredibly effective, especially in our current media environment.
The article talks about how the shift from a mass media era to our current fragmented digital landscape has really accelerated the spread of disinformation.
Think about it. In the past, we had a limited number of trusted news sources, newspapers, television networks, radio stations acting as gatekeepers of information. But now, with the internet and social media, anyone can publish anything, and it can spread like wildfire.
So instead of a few authoritative voices, we're now bombarded with information from all directions, and it's harder than ever to know what to believe.
Exactly. And this abundance of information, combined with declining trust in traditional institutions, has created a perfect storm for disinformation to flourish.
The article specifically points to the rise of alternative media ecosystems like Breitbart and InfoWars that often mimic legitimate news formats while pushing biased or completely fabricated information.
These outlets often use inflammatory language and emotionally charged imagery to tap into people's fears and prejudices. And because they operate outside the bounds of traditional journalism, they're not bound by the same standards of accuracy and fact-checking.
So they can basically say whatever they want, regardless of whether it's true or not, and people will still believe it.
Unfortunately, that's often the case, especially if it reinforces their existing beliefs or confirms their suspicions about the world.
And the article describes how these alternative media outlets have become incredibly sophisticated in their use of technology and social media to spread their messages.
That's right. They've mastered the art of using algorithms, targeted advertising, and social media bots to reach specific audiences and amplify their narratives. They also create echo chambers where their followers are constantly exposed to the same information, reinforcing their beliefs and making them even more resistant to outside perspectives.
It sounds like these disinformation campaigns are incredibly well organized and strategic. It's not just random people posting things online. There's a real method to the madness.
Absolutely. The article dives into some of the specific tactics that are often used in these campaigns.
Hmm.
One common approach is to create what they call alternative information networks.
Okay.
Websites, blogs, social media groups
Hmm.
that echo and reinforce specific narratives.
So they build their own little universes of information where everything points back to their agenda?
Precisely.
Well,
Because these networks are often self-contained, it becomes very...
so it's like creating an artificial groundswell of support to make it seem like a certain idea or belief is more popular than it actually is.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that can be incredibly effective in swaying public opinion. If you see hundreds of people tweeting the same message, you might start to believe it yourself, even if you were initially skeptical.
Uh-huh. The article also talks about how these disinformation campaigns often target specific demographics with personalized content and emotional appeals. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Sure. It's all about understanding your audience and tailoring your message to resonate with their specific concerns, fears, and desires.
Okay.
They might use data analytics and profiling techniques to identify vulnerable groups, people who are already predisposed to believe certain things or who are experiencing some kind of hardship or anxiety.
And then they exploit those vulnerabilities by feeding them information that confirms their biases or promises a solution to their problems.
Exactly. It's a very calculated and often cynical approach to manipulation,
Right.
and unfortunately can be very effective.
This all sounds incredibly disturbing, but it also raises the question of who's behind these disinformation campaigns. Is it just fringe groups and individuals, or are there larger forces at play?
That's a great question, and the article delves into the issue of foreign interference and information warfare. It's become increasingly clear that disinformation isn't just a domestic problem. It's now being used by nation-states as a tool to destabilize their rivals and influence political processes around the world.
The article specifically highlights Russia's use of disinformation tactics to interfere in elections and sow discord in Western democracies. They talk about the Russian troll factory, the Internet Research Agency, which employed hundreds of people to spread propaganda and manipulate online conversations.
Yeah, it's a chilling example of how sophisticated these operations have become. And it's not just Russia that's engaging in this type of information warfare. Other countries, including China and Iran, have also been accused of using similar tactics.
So disinformation has essentially become a weapon in the arsenal of modern warfare. It's like a new form of espionage or sabotage.
Gosh, you could say that. And it's a very effective weapon because it's relatively cheap, difficult to detect, and can have a devastating impact on the target country. It can erode trust in institutions, sow division among the population, and ultimately undermine the very foundations of democracy.
The article makes a very compelling case for why disinformation poses such a profound challenge to democracies. Can you explain why this is such a critical issue?
Well, as you know, democracies are built on certain principles: free and fair elections, freedom of speech, an independent judiciary, and a belief in the rule of law. All of these principles rely on a shared understanding of reality, a common set of facts that we can agree on.
So if everyone's living in their own little information bubbles, believing completely different things, it becomes impossible to have a functioning democracy.
Exactly. If we can't agree on basic facts, how can we have a rational debate about policy? How can we hold our leaders accountable? How can we make informed decisions about the future of our country?
The article doesn't sugarcoat the potential consequences of disinformation. They warn that as trust in institutions erodes, it becomes easier for authoritarian leaders and movements to gain power, dismantle democratic norms, and even incite violence and discrimination.
It's a bleak picture, but unfortunately, we're already seeing some of these consequences play out in the real world. The rise of populism, the increase in political polarization, the erosion of trust in the media, all of these trends can be traced back, at least in part, to the spread of disinformation.
It's a sobering thought, but the article doesn't just leave us with a sense of despair. They also offer some potential solutions, right?
That's right. They emphasize that combating disinformation requires a multi-pronged approach. It's not something that any one person or organization can solve on their own. It's going to require a collective effort from governments, tech companies, educators, journalists, and citizens.
So what are some of the specific things that can be done?
Well, one of the most important things is to invest in media literacy education. We need to teach people how to critically evaluate information, identify bias, and recognize disinformation tactics.
So basically, we need to equip people with the tools they need to become more discerning consumers of information.
Exactly. We need to help people understand that not everything they see online is true, that there are often hidden agendas and motivations behind the information they're consuming. And we need to teach them how to fact-check information, how to evaluate the credibility of sources, and how to recognize the warning signs of disinformation.
The article also talks about the role of social media platforms in combating disinformation. What kind of responsibility do they have in this fight?
That's a complex issue.
Yeah.
On the one hand, these platforms have a responsibility to prevent the spread of harmful content, including disinformation. They need to be more proactive in identifying and removing fake accounts, bots, and content that violates their terms of service.
But at the same time, they need to be careful not to censor legitimate speech or stifle open debate. It's a delicate balance.
It is, and it's something that these platforms are still struggling to figure out. But the article argues that they need to do more to address the underlying algorithms and systems that allow disinformation to spread so easily.
Like how their recommendation engines can create echo chambers and filter bubbles where people are only exposed to information that reinforces their existing beliefs.
Exactly. And they also need to be more transparent about how their algorithms work so that users can understand how they're being influenced and make more informed choices about the information they consume.
The article also suggests that we need to hold these platforms accountable for the consequences of their actions. What does that look like in practice?
Well, it could involve things like fines, regulations, or even legal action if they fail to take sufficient steps to prevent the spread of disinformation. We need to make it clear that there are real-world consequences for allowing their platforms to be used to undermine democracy and spread harmful content.
And the article also emphasizes the importance of supporting independent journalism and fact-checking initiatives.
Absolutely. In an era of information overload, it's more important than ever to have trusted sources of information that are committed to accuracy and impartiality. And fact-checking organizations play a vital role in debunking false claims and holding those who spread disinformation accountable.
So it seems like we're facing a real uphill battle here. You said earlier that there's a multi-pronged approach to fighting disinformation. What are some of the other things that can be done?
Well, the article emphasizes the importance of strengthening democratic institutions and addressing the root causes of public distrust.
Okay, that makes sense. If people feel like the system is broken and that their voices aren't being heard, they're more likely to be susceptible to disinformation that tells them the whole thing is rigged.
Precisely. People are more likely to fall prey to extreme ideologies and conspiracy theories when they feel like they've been left behind or ignored by the mainstream.
So what can be done to address these underlying issues?
Well, it's a complex problem with no easy solutions. But the article suggests that promoting political reforms that address the root causes of public distrust could be a good place to start.
Like what kinds of reforms?
Things like campaign finance reform to reduce the influence of money in politics, making voting more accessible to ensure that everyone has a voice, and increasing transparency in government to build trust and accountability. Essentially making the system feel fairer and more responsive to the needs of ordinary people.
That sounds good in theory, but how do we actually make those kinds of changes happen?
It requires a sustained effort from both citizens and policymakers. Citizens need to demand better from their elected officials and hold them accountable for their actions. And policymakers need to be willing to listen to their constituents and make the necessary changes to restore faith in the system.
Easier said than done, right?
It definitely won't be easy, but the alternative is to allow disinformation to continue to erode the foundations of our democracies, which could have disastrous consequences.
Okay, so we've talked about the big picture stuff, but what about on an individual level? What can we as ordinary people do to combat disinformation and protect our democracies?
The article emphasizes that simply calling out lies or trying to debunk disinformation with facts isn't always effective. In fact, it can sometimes backfire and make people even more entrenched in their beliefs.
That's interesting. So what's the best way to approach these conversations?
The article suggests that focusing on building relationships and finding common ground can be more productive than trying to win an argument. Instead of immediately attacking someone's beliefs, try to understand why they hold those beliefs. What are their fears? What are their hopes? What are the underlying emotional needs that are being met by those beliefs?
So it's more about listening and empathizing than lecturing or trying to correct someone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Remember, people are more likely to be receptive to new information if it comes from someone they trust. Building relationships, fostering dialogue, and engaging in respectful conversations can be much more effective than simply bombarding someone with facts and figures.
It's about meeting people where they are not where we want them to be.
Precisely. And it requires patience, empathy, and a willingness to engage in difficult conversations.
The article also suggests that we can support organizations that are working to combat disinformation and strengthen democratic institutions.
Yes, there are many groups doing incredible work in this area. Fact-checking organizations, media literacy initiatives, pro-democracy advocacy groups.
Yeah.
All of these play a vital role in pushing back against disinformation and protecting democratic values.
And donating to these organizations, volunteering our time, or simply spreading the word about their work can make a real difference.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
We need to support the institutions and individuals who are fighting for truth, accountability, and a more informed public.
Well, this deep dive has been incredibly insightful. It's given me a lot to think about for sure. And thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of disinformation. We hope you found this conversation informative and thought-provoking, and that it's given you some tools and strategies to navigate this increasingly complex information landscape. Remember to be critical, be curious, and stay engaged. The fight for truth is an ongoing one, and we all have a role to play.
Well said.